Hey everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webcast, Designing for Human Behavior, presented by Library Journal and sponsored by Agati Furniture. I'm Joshua Bean, webcast manager for Library Journal, and I'll be your moderator today. We're going to get started with the presentation in just a moment, right after a little bit of housekeeping info. So the layout of your screen is completely customizable, and you can resize any of the windows, so feel free to move them around to adjust them as needed. If you close any of the windows, you can bring them back up by clicking on the appropriate button down in the toolbar. If you'd like to chat with your fellow attendees during the webcast, you can do that using the attendee chat window. But if you'd like to ask any questions of the presenter, be sure to submit your questions over in the Q&A window, and you can put those in there. You can put those in there at any time, and we'll address them at the end after the presentation. You'll find a copy of the slide deck over in the resource list window, and you will be able to download your continuing education certificate after you've met the viewing requirements. If you have any technical difficulties as you're watching, you can click on the help widget where you can find the system requirements and the FAQs. Usually with this platform, if you're having a problem with the sound or the slides are not updating, just refresh the web page. Just hit that refresh button on your internet browser, and usually a refresh will correct most of the glitches you might experience. But if not, you can send me a message through the Q&A, and I'll try to help you figure out your problem. The webcast is being recorded, so if you miss any part of it, or if you want to share it with someone, the on-demand recording is usually ready to watch within a few hours of the live broadcast. Okay, all that good stuff out of the way. I'd like to introduce Joe Agati Jr., who's the Director of Design and the CIO at Agati Furniture. And Joe's gonna get us started here. So take it away, Joe.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. And thanks everybody for joining us today. Like we said earlier, we're gonna be talking about designing for human behavior. So just to give a little quick background on me, I have a degree in industrial design. So that means I don't design factories, but I design things for industry. So products, a lot of people with this degree go into packaging, toy design, as we'll see here, things like that. But it's designing stuff for industry. And I started my career off before joining the family business at Radio Flyer, which is a toy company I think most people know for the red wagons. They're based here on the west side of Chicago. Great company, family owned. They're in their third generation, over 100 years now. Actually didn't look like this when I was there. This is one of their newer renovations they did in the last 5 years. Awesome space. Besides all that, what I really enjoyed about working there, not only was it fun, great culture, great atmosphere, but they share the same kind of approach and philosophy to designing and developing product based on observing people. So these are some of the products that I worked on and I managed while I was there. I did work on a wagon project, but I mostly worked on the trike and ride-on team. But each product you see here has a story behind it based on some kind of observation and finding what they call, Radio Flyer would call a key consumer insight and innovating off of that. So the wagon up in the corner here, it was very common, and I'm sure they still do this now, where they're going to parks, parades, the zoo, observing people with wagons, wagon-like products, strollers, things like that, and observing how kids and parents are interacting with them, and then trying to find those kind of key consumer insights, innovating off of that. And it's actually a very rewarding experience. It's, you have to be kind of careful standing around a public area trying to take pictures of kids and not get in trouble. But when you see people pulling wagons, strapping coolers and bags to them, probably maybe not the best experience that we want to create for somebody. And we know that wagons take kids to fun. So we said there's got to be a better way to do it. So there's all this real estate in the back of the wagon. How do we optimize that experience, make something more integrated, and again, improve that user, kind of key consumer experience there. So every one of these, like I said, every one of these products has a similar story. So if we take an example, just as another one, the trike down in the bottom corner. Trikes are great way for kids to learn how to pedal and ride a bike, but they're inherently unstable. They sit high off the ground typically. You got one wheel in the front, two wheels in the back. And so watching kids, and sometimes kids will get on trikes as early as like 1.5. Pedaling can be challenging for some kids to learn how to develop. It's a complex muscle motion for them. So watching kids try to climb on, try to tip over, there's got to be a better way to do it. So if we lower the seat to the floor, telescope the bike so it's a little more kind of fit for them, put the legs in line with the pedals, making it a little easier to kind of develop that proprioception needed to develop the pedaling motion. Again, creating that better kind of user experience based off of observing behavior. And so I joined the company in 2012. So I've been here for a little over 10 years now. But every product here has a story like that. Some more innovative than others, right? Not everything's going to have this really deep, innovative story. But even when the company first started, library furniture was like all wood, arts and crafts. All the furniture had to match. And so, when my father started kind of working on projects like that, he started asking, well, why do library chairs have to be uncomfortable? They don't have to be. We can make wooden chairs that fit people appropriately, accommodate the behavior at the table, which was typically studying. We got into the libraries kind of into the 90s, so computers were just starting to come in. So we said, well, we can make a library chair comfortable. So looking at the pitch of the chair, putting a steam bent lumbar in the back of it, making that wooden chair comfortable. And like I said, every one of the products you see here has a similar story like that behind it. So again, just for the sake of repeating myself, where does it all come from? It comes from observing human behavior. And that's really what drives us in what we do here. And so, it's one where obviously we're using it because, it helps us understand what people need in spaces. But, why else do we care about this? Obviously, it's not just so we can make product. It's more so to look at like mental health and wellness is important. And so when I first started giving this presentation, again, this was pre-pandemic a while ago, I had to spend a lot more time explaining the importance of mental health and wellness. And I think what's a silver lining of, being on the other side of a worldwide pandemic is we kind of have a better understanding and appreciation for this, where people would ask me like, how has COVID changed furniture design or spaces? And my response typically is that it hasn't really changed it. I think it's changed us in understanding of like what people need to feel comfortable, and we're more willing to give it to them, or willing to try to figure out how to provide that to them. Where before, we're always dealing with constraints. Before, we would kind of box ourselves in, well, we have to meet this seat count, and we have to do this, and we have to do that. And I think we have a greater appreciation of understanding of space and flow and things like that to build in that mental health and wellness aspect. Because at the end of the day, we're all trying to get to a state of peace of mind, right? We just want to feel comfortable where we are. So I use Maslow's hierarchy of needs to try to help explain some of what we're going to kind of talk about here. And so for those of you that know, Maslow was a sociologist in the 40s and 50s, and he had this hierarchy of needs here. And you start at the bottom with your psychological and safety needs, food, water, warmth, rest, safety, security, and kind of move all the way up to self-actualization. And so if you kind of bucket it, you have your basic needs, your psychological needs, and then your self-fulfillment needs. Well, moving up the pyramid here, or the hierarchy here, is great, but you can't really do that if you're not addressing the basic needs. If you're not satisfying the fundamentals that are going to help people feel comfortable in an environment, you're not going to get to a higher level experience. And so a lot of this I kind of tie to thinking about where we evolved from, right? We didn't just kind of pop out of the ground, we're all sitting here. We evolved over time. So, our early ancestors, we would gather in caves, gather in groups, that provided us warmth, food, security. For those of you that are familiar with terms of biophilia, or the points of biophilia, we're hardwired to seek out refuge, right? Refuge means our survival. Being able to survey our environment. Prospect means our survival. That's how our species has survived over time. So these things are ingrained in us. So if you think back to the caveman days, and what did cave people encounter as stress, right? It's either prey, maybe some other group of, early humans that we don't know, fighting over resources. And this triggers a stress response. And stress is not necessarily a bad thing. Again, thinking about how we evolved, stress has allowed us to survive. What we fight or flight, we either fight off something or we run faster than the person behind us and we survive, right? And adrenaline, cortisol, these are stress chemicals because they're released into our body and allows us to do this. And again, this is how we've survived over time. Well, modern human, there's a lot of things that stress us, right? Maybe like crowds, unknown spaces, unknown people, money, job, kids. I have 2 kids now. They can be a blessing and also a stressor at the same time in our lives. But none of these are life-threatening, right? But you still get the response, right? You get the adrenaline, cortisol, you get the stress response. Or we're receiving a stress response much more than our bodies were designed to handle this. This is where that, again, mental health and wellness comes into play here. So going, again, my roots, some of my roots in design come back from observing children at play. But think about when, children make forts. I was a fort kid growing up, probably no shock there. But forts are great, right? They're these these little rooms or cavities or whatever that are low to the ground, the ceiling's low. Because think about it from a child's perspective, the world is overwhelming. I didn't realize, and I kind of forgotten, I didn't realize, but I totally forgot until I had kids, and they'd say oh, it's so loud. I'm like, it's not that loud. But yeah, my hearing's been reduced over time. But I remember being a kid, everything being extra loud, everything's too tall. And so what do? They seek out the space that makes them feel comfortable. Again, this survival, this need to seek out refuge. And then, inside your little fort, everything's at your level. Sometimes you made with a blanket, so it's got that kind of warm, sensory kind of element in there. And so when we think about behavior, think about over time, where we evolve and where we are now, our species has only been kind of in existence for a very short period of time, compared to the planet, the universe, things like that. But still, relative to us, a long period of time, and our behaviors evolved over that. So the reason I bring that up is we think about the things that evolved around us, like iPod to iPad, very fast, 15 years, very dramatic evolution of that product. How we communicate. I'm an old millennial, so I remember the dial-up internet days. I remember, I'm getting a note here. So I remember the dial-up internet days. I remember, paying, for the internet by minute in there. And, how communication has changed dramatically over a long period of time. So when we think about behavior over time, there's really not, and again, going back to the question I get about COVID, how has COVID changed us? I mean, we saw some intervals in there for a short period of time. It's we feel like we needed some more space. And now that's kind of come back. We don't feel this need to be 6 feet apart all the time. But our behavior kind of stays somewhat static. So for example, I like these 2 kind of pictures because they're great 2 snapshots in time, right? You got 10 years apart. And so things have changed in that 10 years, 2006 to 2016. You have technology change, right? Like we saw, before. So I graduated in 2006. And so that was a time when it was very common to go to the library and access computers. As a design student, it was very common to go to a computer lab to access CAD and rendering software and things like that. Nowadays, it's really common. You're going to have, students are going to have 1, 2, 3 multiple devices with them. So the technology's evolved. What's really interesting, and the reason why I like this photo, is that the behavior hasn't really changed. So if you look at the 2 photos, where does everybody sit? Right in the middle of the bank hat. What do they have next to them? Their bag. What do they still have in front of them? I remember 2006. 10 years. There's going to be no more paper. Everything's going to be on the computer. Everybody's got a book in front of them. I walk into installs. I do a lot of field research. The sea of paper that students still use is, it's actually kind of nice to see, right? It's a very engaging way to learn. I was just down at the University of Central Florida, and almost every seat was filled. Almost everybody has a book in front of them. At least 80% of people did. So, that behavior has not changed over time, even though with the influence of technology in there. So why else do we care about this? Well, we care about utilization of space, right? So if we can hit that right balance, we'll talk a little bit about here in this in a second. If we hit that right balance in a space, we're good at much higher utilization. We'll talk about aesthetics. Aesthetics play a role, so holding our aesthetic over time, and then not wasting money, right? So if we can hit the balance, hit the right aesthetics, it'll save us money over a long period of time. It'll keep the product and space relevant. So I want to dive a little further into this this North Park example here, because it's something kind of, when we talk about balance, interesting story. So when they first opened up the space, they had a big atrium and they wanted to utilize it more. So they had ottomans, and we were told that the kids nicknamed it the Ottoman Empire. Really low utilization though. Everything's kind of open. They thought, and I think the rationale at the time makes sense, right? We're going to have a space where you can just plop down, stop for a little bit, but maybe it's just too open for that environment. And so we came in, worked with the architects on it, and then they wanted to use something more enclosed, our curved banquettes. And so I was like, well, this is a great kind of like use case study. Let's go out and let's observe and see what happens. And so the utilization went up. It got better. I would say though, it swung the pendulum too far to one side, so they created more private but all group. And so if you notice, what I don't like to see is two people working in banquettes set up for like 3 to 4 people. That is not, like you said, the utilization we're looking for. But this was kind of emerging around the time of like, hey, we know we've been really heavy on the group side. I think we're starting to forget about the individual side. But again, this time we had just launched a product not too much before then we installed this, that kind of started to address it. And we'll talk about that as we go through the presentation here. But really it's hitting that right balance, right? It swung a little too far to the other side. And that happens, right? We kind of get caught up in the immediacy, we get caught up in trends. And it is very tricky. It's very tricky finding the balance. But always, I always stress to people, just keep asking yourself, are we hitting the right balance of what we need? So as we're kind of going through this presentation today, we're going to be talking about behavior through the lens of public space. And there's 2 reasons for that. One being that's where we spend most of our time, right? We don't really make office furniture. We're not office furniture experts. We focus on public space environments. And then 2, that's where we're most vulnerable. So inside of here, we're going to focus on 3 elements. One being space. So not so much the interior architecture, which obviously plays a heavy role in the success of an environment, but really about the space around us and between us. We're going to talk about this haven. So this is something we kind of noticed early on. People seek out this like environment where I call it this warm blanket feeling. Like I said, biophilia calls it refuge effect. And then we're going to talk about comfort, and talking about comfort more from like the physical sense. Obviously the first 2 parts a little more mental, last part is more physical side. So talking about product, pairing right piece of furniture with maybe right activity over time. So we'll touch on that at the end here. So space, like I said, it's not the architecture interior, which is important. It's the space between us, right? We're going to talk about what that means. So when we think about that, I used to be like, I'm sure people have heard this, where it's like, hey, this is like my personal zone or my bubble, right? We have this like invisible field around us. And depending on where we are and who we're with, that field can shrink and grow. So I give the example of, again, I grew up in Chicago here, so I'm an urbanite. Anybody that's had to take public transportation, like after we've done the clock roll back, so it's like December, it's 5 o'clock and it's pitch black out. And so you're standing outside waiting for the bus, and maybe it's like around the holiday. So it's not late, but it's really quiet. And, you get on and maybe you're the only one on the bus, let's say, and you go a stop or 2, and then, someone's getting on. And then usually your first kind of reaction is like a quick moment of panic, like, oh my God, I don't want this person to sit next to me. They're a stranger. I don't know them. We've all agreed on social norms that it's not socially acceptable in our society to sit right next to somebody with every other seat open on the bus. But what do? They sit down. And it's kind of weird, right? This is like not really what we're used to. But the flip side, if someone gets on the bus, you do know them. They don't sit next to you or maybe sit in the seat in front of you or something, maybe make an engagement into you. It's off-putting as well. So like we said, that bubble will shrink and grow depending on who we are, who we're with, and where we are. But for most planning purposes, or we're kind of thinking about space, I usually tell people 12 inches is a good kind of rule to kind of consider in there. More is always better, not tons more, but more is always better. And we'll talk about where the 12 inches comes from in there. But that seems to help people like that kind of amount of separation. So just to give you kind of a few examples of this, like looking at from a table perspective, and I'm sure we've all had, the spaces where we have a room full of large tables, and there's nothing wrong with large tables. Don't get me wrong. This is where the balance comes in. But if we're out of balance, that's all we have at large tables. What do we see happen? We see the room start to fill up, and the first person to sit down usually sits in the middle. Well, why? You think about it from a space perspective. I can put my bag on one seat. I can kind of, most likely someone's not going to sit next to me on the other side. So I get to have this whole half of a table to myself. And again, what'll inevitably happen, the room will hit critical mass, and then someone will sit down, and they typically sit at the corner. Well, why the corner? One, they can probably put their bag on the seat next to them to try to create that buffer for them. Two, it's a little weird to sit directly across from somebody you don't know. Now you're going to be making eyes at some stranger. And then, you can kind of carve out, this kind of implied refuge, carve out your kind of little real estate in there. Again, the room will fill up, you have critical mass, and then what happens? Then someone will sit at the other corner there. And so, I'm not saying this happens exactly every time, but this is a very common seating pattern that you'll see. And so you get this kind of zigzaggy seating pattern in there. And so what happens is you start asking questions. And we run into this a lot in the airport side. We'll talk about this from seating, is that, well, do we really need all these seats? And yet maybe you do, right? We have peak times that are just, while they're only peak times, we do have to account for those. Or we have to hit a seat count to, make sure we have funding or rankings or something like that. I'm not saying those constraints don't exist. But really it's like, do we, really should be asking ourselves, is these lost seats? Do we really need this? Because people are wanting about this much space to work with. And so saying then, how do we move the design of the product around to accommodate the behavior? So the benefit of, a zigzag table, not a wave, which is different. The wave would be all equal all equal arcs. This is a big and a small arc. Is one, you're kind of giving people the space they kind of want. Two, you're putting them inside the table, building on that kind of space, that personal bubble, and implied refuge in there. I usually tell people, don't seat people at the peak of arcs, whether they're waves or zigzaggy tables. You're kind of thrusting them out into the environment. But they are nice team zone areas. So, which has been interesting, products like this have been around for a long time. And I always like to really observe them, because I think we still think of them as individual seats, just because of the design and shape. But it's really common that you'll get 2 or 3 people to kind of work next to each other, across from each other, and that kind of space in between becomes a teamwork zone for them. Zigzag tables are great. They are footprint intensive, right? Not everything's going to fit everything here, but from a public library perspective, in those table sections, each one is 48 inches wide, so it's footprint intensive. A lot of public libraries can't divvy up that space, but you can still accomplish similar design layouts. It's not in a common way, hey, we want to keep things flexible, we're going to go smaller, more individual. Again, just thinking about it from that perspective, and going back to, hey, do we need all of these chairs, right? One, on the floor, or two, do we need them at all to kind of work with the behavior that people want? So that's kind of been looking at the table from kind of the top-down perspective, and that's when we started this presentation. That's where we would kind of just leave it. As this has evolved, we started kind of doing more high tables, getting more requests, doing more work with airports. And it was an interesting kind of evolution when we start kind of looking kind of out of the room. And so when you think about it from, kind of different vantage points, right? You'd have someone seated at a low table or a standard kind of height table, someone at like a high or a standing table, and then someone walking through the environment. So there's kind of the three different vantage points that you'll get. And so you kind of start to compare like head heights or kind of viewpoints, this prospect, right? So the person at the high table has the same ability to prospect over the environment as someone walking through, but someone at the seated table really has a like diminished kind of field of vision. And then if you think about from where both are kind of sitting but working, right? Now you're going to be relying on their peripherals. So even someone at a high table, their peripheral still has a pretty good vantage height over the space. So this gives them that sense of comfort. And so what we've seen, what's been interesting, is as the table moves up, the amount of space people need between each other to kind of feel comfortable starts to shrink a bit. People will be more tolerant of sitting next to each other, as they get into the higher tables. So looking from a table perspective, but not looking at it from a seating perspective. Again, similar principle happens, just a little different kind of use pattern here. So think about it, when we have like rows of seats, what do? We want to create space in there. We want to like allow people to sit next to each other. So we put an arm in. The arm's only like 4 inches wide. So it doesn't really create space. Someone's still going to put the bag right next to them, right? To kind of stake their claim. Well, if we start putting that, then you get that lost seat factor. So then if you start putting that 12 inches in there, now you have a space for the bag. It's kind of somewhere 12 inches comes. It's kind of like the minimum of what you need to get a bag in there. And then that helps to define that space, right? I'm defining like, hey, this is mine, that's yours. You're probably not going to cross over my bag or something. And then they're not taking up a full seat next to them. And so again, you'll get two people to kind of sit next to each other, and the bag has to go somewhere. This does apply to tables, but a lot of with seating, it's I'm always asking, where's the bag going to go? Where does the bag go? Because it's going to go somewhere. A lot of these environments and a lot of the spaces we're talking about, people are bringing bags, right? They're coming to these places to spend time. Sometimes there's touchdown stuff, but if they have devices and things, they're going to have a bag. It's got to go somewhere. And so looking at seating, one, space is in there, and this kind of will start to tie into what we talk about next with Haven and Refuge, is you can start integrating panels into it. So looking at what would be like a traditional group of chairs around a table. And again, this is not a reason never to do this, but really trying to strike that right balance in there. It's not uncommon. Some person would sit down, probably put their bag down. Maybe someone sit across from, maybe nobody, because again, we talked about the stranger eye creep factor across from someone else in there. We'll say that their bags are going to go down on the seats. Again, trying to create separation. So a lot of times maybe you get 1 to 2 people, unless it's a deliberate group. It's a pretty footprint intensive space of chairs. When we think about reconfiguring those chairs, adding the panels in, you will get 4 people to sit in this type of environment. They're all facing out from each other. And the benefit of that, you take an 80 square feet down to 30 square feet. So you get 4 people to sit in 30 square feet versus maybe 1 to 2 in there. So this is going back to that balance. What do I observe more of my space? Am I observing that, hey, we have more group, so we need to have group environments, which, the 4 chairs around a table does work. But it's like, wait, no, we have more individual users, and we're losing all this footprint to one person sitting there. We need to get back into balance. How do we find an engaging way and kind of a space to make people feel comfortable for individual users? And that's where that kind of other kind of rearranged footprint comes into play. So like I said, we started talking about panels, and this does play into this Haven or Refuge effect. So we first started kind of to notice this behavior, and it's one of those ones. It's a fun one too, because it's kind of like it's like duh. It's like this aha moment where we're in these environments and we see people congregate in the banquettes. They go to the banquettes. Well, why the banquettes and not the carols? And so, for example, going back to this Florida and North Park kind of contrast here, like we said, the behavior didn't really change. Everybody's sitting right in the middle. They're putting the bag next to them. And I always like to point out too, because the 2 people sitting in the middle on the North Park one are actually sitting on a seam. Actually, it's a little more comfortable. They just move to the left or the right a little bit. But people seem to like gravitate towards that enveloping kind of element in there. And so why are they using these and not the carols, right? Carols, they have privacy, right? You got your front privacy, your blinders on, heads down, you can do work. So why are they electing to go to these other spaces where people are staring out into the environment? And so what they don't provide is this feeling of security, right? Your back is exposed in a carrel. So we started to kind of realize it's like, hey, like people they gravitate towards those bank hats. They love those bank hats. But we keep seeing one person in a bank hat meant for multiple people. Going back to utilization, I don't like to see that. We missed it. So we missed something there. So we take like I said, we need to take the carrel, and we got to put them inside of it, because there's something about once somebody's inside of it, you're covering the back, which is really what people starts to build that haven or refuge effect, which is a little weird to think about too. You want to cover the front. So now you have privacy and security, and that front becomes kind of critical if able to do it. It's harder to do, but I do get a lot of feedback that when it's products that like the front is covered and the back, people will gravitate to those first versus a product where just their back and sides are covered. It is kind of visually distracting in there. So lots of times when we're talking about priorities, if possible, one, covering the back, that helps, right? That we know that builds a feeling of comfort. I mean, think about the booths. Everybody goes to the brunch on Sundays. Where do you want to sit? You want to sit in the booth, right? Booth usually means your back's covered or something like that. Well, if you can cover the front of somebody, you're cutting down on the visual distractions as people walking by, and that really helps with people focus. If you're in environments where there's you have students or patrons that have like sensory overload, that helps a lot. It's harder to do, right? Because it's not like, it's easy to put chairs and a bank hat along the back of a wall, covering their back. You're not just going to put, a table with a huge divider kind of in front of everybody. That's going to create an aesthetic issue. But thinking about creating those spaces where you can offer that to people. And then if you can cover a side, that helps too. It helps kind of complete that kind of hugging effect in there. So that's usually how I kind of coach people. If you can, or if you have to prioritize, thinking about it from kind of that perspective. So I want to just stay on panels for another minute here, because again, kind of like tables, we started looking at it all from like the top down perspective with panels, and we were kind of overlooking again that prospect element. We're really hyper focused on the refuge side of things, and we used to get, and we still get like requests like, hey, can you make the panels taller? And so, the taller the panel goes, there's a bit of a diminishing return in there. And so I kind of stress that from two angles. So one, I tell people, like, think of the zone of security usually exists somewhere between 39 and 48 inches. As you go higher than that, you might be creating more privacy for the person sitting there. Maybe. I kind of have, theories and questions on like, hey, is it actually feel like it's coming over on top of them at a certain point? But let's say you are. The challenge is, think about everybody else entering the space. Can't forget about that. We get hyper focused on the person in the product, which is fine, but they're not the only person interacting in the environment. So the higher that panel goes, the closer someone needs to get to that product to see if somebody's working there, then disrupting them, hurting that refuge that you work so hard to create. So the nice thing about 48 inches, I like that one from a manufacturing perspective. But two, it's this really nice sweet spot, because probably from 3 to 4 feet away, depending on the height of the person, you can see if somebody's working in there. You don't have to get that close. You could stand from a distance and they would never know you're there. Two, the person sitting there, again, that hits like the vast majority of the population. They can do what I call a neck stretch and just kind of check out the space and then kind of like hunker back down, like do the golfer, kind of pop out, look around, and then come back down. It's that kind of nice sweet spot and that really nice balance for both people coming through the space and the person working there. So there's lots of products that again, there's a lot of products out in the environment that kind of offer these types of solutions. So one of the last elements I want to talk about, talk about comfort. We said comfort. First two elements were more on the kind of like psychological side, building in comfort. This one is more on the physical side here. Excuse me. So from a comfort standpoint, we want to talk about different kind of seating and products, and how they kind of, the difference between them and how they work off of each other. And so we're going to talk about lounge. So this is kind of what a lounge chair is. This working lounge, and there's long working and quick working activity as well. So lounge, somewhat self-explanatory, right? But usually what people don't really pick up on the subtle is that a lounge chair is going to sit lower to the ground. It's going to sit more reclined, deeper. So we've said it falls in this 20-20 rule. So what we mean by that is it's going to be like 20 degrees on the recline. Now, they're not all exactly 20 degrees. So don't start taking, a protractor out and measuring it there. But they're going to be more reclined than a chair you're going to put at a table, and they're going to sit deeper. They're going to suck you in, right? You want to be sucked into that chair, and they're going to sit a little lower to the ground. And so lounge chairs are great for lots of times people don't think about it, like short activities, waiting rooms, doing things like checking your phone, checking your tablet, shorter kind of activities. And then they kind of leapfrog, and it's like, okay, either someone's going to be there very quickly, or they're going to be there for a very long time. It's not kind of a middle ground. I'm going to sit there 60 to 90 minutes. I'm going to hang out, read my book, read a magazine, maybe just hang out and talk with friends, gather socially in there. The next element is that kind of longer working pattern we talked about, where it's this 10-18-18 rule. And so what we mean by that, kind of like the lounge chair, is that it's going to be more vertical, right? Again, not always exactly 10 degrees. Every chair kind of sits a little different. It always needs to be tweaked for its own comfort. Nothing is a true formula in there. But it's going to sit more vertical. It's all about that vertical back support paired with a table. And it's going to sit shallower because, again, you're going at a table here. We'll talk about why that's important here in a second. And it's going to sit a little higher. And so one thing I want to stress, though, too, is because, again, we talk about high tables. People really like them. They're great in the space. They help separate environments. Get people that prospect that they want to have, but that seat, that like floor surface needs to come up with the chair. And so, if you want to be 18 inches off the ground, that footrest on your stool needs to be like 17, 18 inches off of there as well. I hate seeing the dangles, and I don't know why people make stools with foot rails so low. It doesn't make any sense to me. But just be aware if you're looking at stools for high tables that make sure you're testing out that foot rail part of it. It's got to you got to keep that proportionality in there. But it's all about that back support because you're at the table. So you're going to sit more upright. You don't really need the arms because, again, your arms are going to go on the table in front of you for working. And so really this is like, we're talking about the back support. And so we get into that kind of working lounge, which essentially is a banquette, but it's not a lounge chair. And so I've seen this kind of go back and forth where I think there was some mismatching and then people got better about it. I'm starting to see some mismatching again. And so the banquette shares that same proportion of kind of the side or pull-up chair in there. But if you compare it to the lounge chair, which is much deeper, lower, more reclined, you're going to get this gap. You're going to get what people start called perching, right? You're going to start perching on the chair. So when you perch, then you slouch, and then you get a pain in your neck. It's not really the most optimal kind of like working kind of body posture in there. And so when we look at these, they're in the same kind of bucket here. They're meant for like longer activities, right? 30 to 90 minutes. I'm going to come here. I'm going to have a bag, probably. I'm going to have stuff with me. I'm geared up to spend a lot of time, 30 to 90 minutes of dining, writing work, computer work, studying. I'm going to spend time. I'm going to camp out. And so the last one is kind of standing height tables. And so standing height tables, standing height kind of access points are great in these spaces. Quick activities, 39, 42 inches high. We're talking like 10, 15 minutes, something that's quick. I know there's like sit to stand products out there that people use in their office. I know people have been trying to offer that more in the spaces. But even standing, working for an hour at a time is not always the best for your body as well. But for touchdown spaces, this is a great option. So again, we're talking about quick touchdown stuff. So I like to take these and I lay these out kind of like on a time scale, mostly just to kind of get people to consider like the space and how it lays out and flow and things. And so you don't really want, if you're putting a lot of lounge chairs, this is kind of quick turnover. You don't want to intermix that inside of like what would be a camping area of like high tables, low tables with pull-up chairs and things like that. This is what I was talking about with the high tables. What's great is because that they get that prospect, they're much more willing to tolerate sitting closer to high traffic environments, knowing that's going to be a quick, either someone walking or someone touching down for a short period of time. They're much more willing to tolerate that. And then they create this buffer to people that are spending more time working in there. They create a nice kind of transition. So lots of times we'll see that in like when we do hold rooms, you kind of start to box out some of the perimeter with like high tables, cutting off that traffic, that high traffic walkway, and then allowing people then, let the either the perchers or people that want to sit up high and work, and then kind of creating a protective area for people on the interior that may be sitting low in there. So, today, so we talked about three elements in here. The first one being space. Like we said, it's the space, not so much around us, which is important, but really the space between us. How do we create that separation in there? And that haven refuge effect, right? So it's creating that like kind of warm blanket feeling that we have, that we kind of hardwired to seek out. And the last one being comfort. So not so much the mental side of comfort, which is important. That's what the first two elements are, but talk about that comfort, that more physical side of things, pairing the right kind of activity with the right type of product. So the last one I do want to talk about is aesthetics. And the reason why I don't kind of like lead with aesthetics is that aesthetics is critical. It's that kind of like binding, that binder that kind of brings everything together. So we need to kind of, think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You need to kind of, satisfy those like lower parts, those fundamentals that make people feel comfortable. But you do need to consider aesthetics, because at the end of the day, we're aesthetically driven creatures. Either we're drawn to man-made things of beauty, natural, beauty, grand open spaces. We're aesthetically driven creatures. So for example, like this is a before of a library, and I could go through here and I'm sure I can find refuge and prospect and space and things like that. But it's, it's in need of a renovation, right? But it's a little like there's books everywhere. The lighting needs to be updated. When you probably have some updated carpet, coat of paint. And so, it probably doesn't take a lot to renovate the space, but thinking about where the furniture is placed, how it should be arranged, a little paint, a little light, a little carpet, has a huge impact on the environment in there. Again, these are graduate study rooms, carrels, whatever you want to call them. It's nice. They got some open, nice lighting, sort of see what's out the window. Maybe they got that kind of nice biophilic element. Maybe they can see outside, but they have to walk down like what looks like a prison hallway to get to them. Versus totally different environment, but look at those chairs. I mean, that's not an Agati chair, but it looks like it just wants to give you a big hug. It's right in front of the fire. You've got like the natural stone and the wood, very kind of warm, both from the physical sense and emotional sense, inviting environment. Again, looking, kind of contrasting the two spaces here, both provide same functionality. Groups can meet, individuals can work, but looking at like how the furniture can kind of be rearranged, looking at the wood and the fabric, the carpet in there, hitting the functionality, right? You got the tables that have the wraparound, a little different than the zigzag, but toward similar functionality, creating that implied refuge, creating that separation with the divider panels. So you're not, nobody's looking directly at each other. Groups like privacy too. They like the spaces where the panels are too. But layering on that element of aesthetics, really binding everything together. And so, like we said, you have these three elements and then aesthetics. And aesthetics, while maybe it only counts for 10% of the equation, everything falls apart. So I usually lead with kind of like an example of, I have a background in aviation as well. And so you're taught that, like high school physics, an airplane wing flies because of the Bernoulli principle, high, low pressure creates lift. But until you get to more kind of complex aeronautical classes, aeronautical engineering classes and things like that, that there's an element of air molecules. There has to be a certain amount of air molecules in the air to hold the plane up. So while maybe that only accounts for 10% of the reason why the plane flies, if you don't have enough air molecules, the plane won't get off the ground. So there's like days where it's like hot out in Arizona. It's so hot that the air is so thin that the plane just literally won't take off. So aesthetics kind of works that same way. So we can address these three elements, but if we don't have and think about the space and think about how we're going to react to it from a visual standpoint, everything kind of falls apart. So I want to thank everybody for your time today. Typically I leave 10, 15 minutes for questions here at the end. I'd be happy to take them.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, we have quite a few questions. I was just checking out the last one. We paste one in here. Just make sure we're tracking everything. Got some questions in the attendee chat as well as the Q&A. So let's go back to James from New York Public Library. James says, I've seen some very poor ergonomically designed circulation / information desk spaces for staff that were where staff is standing, the desk is too low, there's barcode scanners, a computer, the staff member is expected to easily use all these devices, but they all differ in their purpose and use. Says he's curious about if you can speak to some of the poorly designed or maybe like better designs for staff workspaces.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm getting, I think it's interesting. I'm getting more and more over the last year or two, getting more questions related to staff spaces. So it's definitely top of mind, which is great, right? Staff play, while I'm talking it more from the patron perspective, obviously staff play a vital role in these environments. So we don't really do a ton of back of office work, but we will do circulation desks and things like that. What I've found in a generality, what's been really helpful is really trying to get an understanding of workflow and needs. That helps to start to shape a lot of the design. I think a lot of this, I think one thing that can be challenging from the furniture perspective, a lot of this does get handed through either architect, designer, to dealer, then to furniture person. So just to make sure your needs and wants are kind of communicated through, kind of all the way through that level. I think things that we found have been successful. So I was kind of poo-pooing lifting desks in the public space, and I'll just be candid, that's not my favorite solution. I'm more in the favor of you have sit and you have stand. You don't need everything in between. That being said, I think where it is real effective is in the staff points. There are a lot of, we don't really do small individual freestanding ones, but there are a lot out there that have incorporated the lifting in really nicely in there. And I think it gives freedom kind of to what you're talking about. There's a lot of functionality going on at these desks. So that is one way that have seen it successful. And the lifting's controlled by a staff member, right? So it's a lot less wear and tear. And then I think thinking through the workflow. So if I'm going to be doing sit, stand, up, down, whatever, where that staff point is coming from, one, making sure those work kind of work patterns identified, but think about the flow. So when thinking through the design, so coming from the person that's kind of maybe sometimes a few steps down, maybe not always up at front, being clear and think through. I mean, you should get visuals of what this is, but take the time to then say, wait, if I have the person sitting here, but they're always and they put the transaction here, they're literally gonna have to stand every time they talk to somebody, versus, okay, we can have the transaction, but maybe the person, the kind of staff point with the patron or the student or something needs to be really more focused over here. So you're not having to get up and up or maybe that's the port where someone does stand for a period of time and we kind of have to adjust the desk that way. So that's a lot of generalities. What I will say is that I think the critical part is making sure whoever you're working with, that your needs and your wants are identified, and then reviewing that design really critically. A lot of times when we're involved, they're usually customized desks. So making sure that we kind of all the parties understand that, and you go through that kind of review process, how is someone going to walk up to it? How is then someone going to service them? Because they all seem to be a little unique. I mean, yes, there's a lot of similarities in what people do, but because they're always in different spaces, they always end up in a little more of a unique space. So hopefully that answers your question. It's a little long-winded.
Cool. Sounds good. Let's jump into another question. This one is from Lindsay. In general, is there a good ratio to use as a start to balance group versus individual seating in a public space?
Yeah, great question. I've always had this like dream I can come up with some kind of questionnaire or magic formula that I could give somebody to say, well, if it's this, this, and this, you should do a 70-30 or a 40-60 or 50-50. I guess if you had to pick something like 50-50, right, is a good place to start, half and half. But I would say before you jump down that road, it's probably worth spending a little bit of time doing a little observation exercise. And it's probably not that hard because you guys are in the spaces a lot. And I've noticed that librarians are very observant people. So I don't think it would be too big of a stretch. But then really kind of paying attention to what the environment is doing. And the reason I say to start there is because each place is a little different. And I will say it does evolve. I'll give you an example. University of Chicago, pre-pandemic, they had 2 noisy floors and like 3 or 4 quiet floors. They used to have a lot of graduate students come to the library. Post-pandemic, a lot of graduate students have not come back to the library, and they've started, either they are or they started opening up more noisy floors. And they did the strategy of like loud on the bottom, quiet as you go up top. A lot of that is student policed. But while they were mostly individual pre-pandemic, they did evolve to more on the groups, like becoming more group, still probably on the more individual side. So their space requirements evolved, still probably heavier on the individual side. And that's something they had observed in their space over a long period of time, than the group. Flip side is I was just down at, like I said, University of Central Florida, heavy group. But when walking through the space, I asked Frank, do you feel like it's a more socially based campus where you're working? And I observed, yes. And he said, well, he's like, maybe, maybe not. We had to cut off some of our quiet and silent study spaces because of renovation. So those spaces were under pressure, and he was getting a lot of pushback. So where I was observing a little bit more, he knew the space better than me, and he was thinking, yeah, it's more like 50-50. So I think starting that kind of visualization exercise, and I think it'll get you into a good understanding. Will you hit it right out of the gate? Probably not, but that's okay. That's the other amount. You got to be able to like learn and adapt. I come from a product development world, and that's like our whole process, iterate. So if you had to pick something, you could go 50-50. But I think starting off and just looking at and observing the way people are working, and I always tell people first choice makes a big difference. So starting at the beginning of the day, where do people choose and how do they choose to work first? That is always really telling, because then they have every option to pick from. So they're going to pick what makes them feel most comfortable. After that, then it's a series of compromises as each other person walks into the space. So observing, seeing first choice. And then I think from there, then you can start to get a good educated guess on what would be a good balance, but still plan to like, hey, there's going to be some fine tuning.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of just depends on your patrons at your library, right? Kind of.
I think what's hard is that it's, I've been doing this for a long time. My dad's obviously been doing this a lot longer. Every space is the same, but it's also unique, right? There's probably, I give the example, like 80% of spaces are all about the same, but that last 20% makes every space kind of unique and can change a lot in there.
Yeah. All right, let's jump into another question here. How do you make the comfortable / private spaces without inviting inappropriate behavior at the public library?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I would say it seems like academics, maybe academic libraries won't agree with me on this. I think they've got it a little easier. Their population is a little more streamlined, still deal with a certain kind of inappropriate behavior, but publics do have it a little harder. I think one element is that panel height. That helps a lot. And if you position product in a certain way, knowing like, hey, I'm going to keep a staff point here, and from this vantage point, I can see in to, I'm still giving them privacy, but I can see in and kind of keep track. You probably can't have floors and floors of that, right? Because you can't keep track of that. But you can probably situate products where you can still see in. Again, I like it from that 48-inch perspective where I don't have to be that close, but I can see what's going on. I think those two things help with that. Anecdotally, I'll say, those round kind of Carol workstations we get a lot of really good feedback. People go to them first. People really like them. Not to say that it hasn't happened. I have not gotten feedback like, oh, I hate that we put these in. There's constant inappropriate behavior in them. I've never gotten that feedback. So it's not to say that doesn't happen. I feel like usually if I hear something once, then there's probably 5 more people out there that have experienced it and I haven't heard it. But it seems to be like a pretty low risk. That's also one reason I'm like less in favor of like the spaces with like completely enclosed roofs. But there's these pod products out there that are like a phone booth basic type thing, which are very popular and serve a great need, right? They're theoretically inexpensive, like study rooms, provide a lot of privacy, good or bad. So I think situating the product so it is visible, and I think you can do that. That panel height, finding that ratio, I think 48 inches is a good kind of height to allow them to feel comfortable and peek in, I think are 2 big ways to kind of tackle that.
Very cool. Let's go ahead and get to a couple more questions here while we have time.
I'll try to talk faster.
It's all good. Would the hugging spaces be flexible to accommodate right-handed and left-handed individuals?
Yeah. Oh, great question. I get this one a lot too. I would say I know you enter on one side. I have both right-handed and left-handed employees, and for whether they like it or not, they get used as guinea pigs quite a bit. Those things work either way. That being said, as Agati, we've made them flipped because some people really want it. Fine, we'll do it. I have not observed that left-hand, right-handed users struggle either way in those. Observed, I should say. I have not gotten the feedback with that, but that being said, left-handed users are such a small part of the population. I could see that maybe if it did bother them, the feedback probably wouldn't make it to me. So I think as long as, because it is actually a good amount of space in there, as long as you're providing the amount of space, it doesn't really matter. It's not like a tablet arm. Tablet arms, we are much more kind of like, hey, we want 80% to be right-hand users and 20% to be for left-handed users. That did make more of a big difference because of the kind of the reach in there. But those kind of like workstations, there's enough space in there that someone can kind of work comfortably, whether they're coming at it from either side in there.
Gotcha. I got a question from Kate. Recommendation, do you have any recommendations for creating a haven/comfort space that would also be accommodating for patrons with mobility issues?
Yeah, great question. That is a tough one because of you could argue from a legal perspective or just a reality with the wheelchair. They need space to roll in and around to get into an environment. So obviously the fixed workstations don't work, right? For example, we offer one where they roll straight in. But is that really truly the Haven effect? No, right? We do it because it carries a similar aesthetics and it has a similar footprint. But it doesn't carry that same kind of aesthetic function. Other ways to do it are more with freestanding furniture. So looking at straight booth seating, one where you can kind of position it so you have a banquette maybe on one side, so you may be giving up a little bit of lost seat, but then you kind of can bring it away from a wall or something, giving someone the space to roll in. We have done modified ones where, again, it's not the round ones, it's the square, which then turn more into rectangular ones where people can kind of roll in. So with those, you get a little bit more. It's hard because the roll in has to be so big and the wall is so far back. I feel like you're losing a lot of it, but there's just a reality, unless like we're going to put somebody roll up and put them on a turntable and turn them into there, there's a space constraint that you kind of have to accept in there. So it's not really, I don't like to use the word fair, but it's really not fair. But there is a geometry kind of challenge in there. So I think looking at it from a freestanding furniture perspective, using maybe some of the architecture of the space is a way to do it. We have handled it as a custom solution, and it's easier. It's easier and possible to do in the more kind of like rectilinear format in there, and that's how it can be done.
Thanks. I think we can squeeze in one more question here.
Okay.
Let's see. Should we get the best one here? Yeah. Does Agati have any furniture designs which are children focused? And second part is, how about furniture which can be used by multi-generational users?
Yeah, good question. So we do have some children's furniture. It is not a strength of ours. The short answer is, due to market size demand and manufacturing constraints, it's been challenging for us to find something that's, I would call it, price competitive. Agati's not cheap to begin with. And then with those kind of constraints, we struggle from that standpoint. So we'll do some children product from time to time. We have some on our website. We used to do more, and we're still able to do them in the lounge chair. We have a lot more flexibility, where we would do kind of child and parent chairs. So like a lounge chair in the small and a lounge chair in the big, or chair in it. So one, I liked those because I come from the toy world where like aspirational play is really exciting for children. So I get to sit in the same chair as mom or dad or brother or sister or whatever is exciting to a child, right? You're now like, I get the same, it's not the same thing, right? It fits them, but it looks the same. It's that aspirational play. Other times what we'll do to satisfy that is we'll do like chair and a halves, right? And so then parent and child kind of sit kind of next to each other in there. But yeah, we are a little bit more limited in that arena, unfortunately.
Awesome. All right, everybody. We are out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and close things out. Thanks, Joe, for an awesome presentation. Got a lot of lots of comments, compliments in the comments for the presentation. So. Yeah, so, and thanks again, everybody, for attending. Just as we close things out, we do just like to remind everyone that the webcast is being recorded. So if you missed any part of it, you can go back and rewatch any of the parts that you missed, or you can share it with someone if you want to do that. If you want to check out any of our other content at Library Journal, you can go to the events and professional development section. That's where we have all of our webcasts, our online courses, our virtual events. We've got a lot of great content going on over there. So I invite you to come over and check that out. So yeah, we'll see you next time, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks.